Yep, it is working now. Hello, good evening, everyone. Well, just under 40 years ago, I was sitting in a dingy office in Greek Street in London's Soho with a couple of my colleagues working at Verso New Left Books, when in with great drama and presence swept this man who I'd never seen before. And he started talking intensely and very convincingly about civil society. Now, at the time, civil society was a rather niche concept, certainly as far as the Western Marxists next door in the New Left Review office. It was very strong meat as well, and not terribly palatable for some of them, it has to be said. However, I'm very glad that tonight's guest stuck to his guns, because over the past 40 years, I think he has proven that that his ideas have not only come out on top, but remain extremely relevant for today. He is one of the greatest theoreticians of democracy that we have. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney and the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. And John studied politics, government and history at the University of Adelaide. He won a Commonwealth Fellowship to study in Toronto, where he was awarded a doctorate in philosophy and political economy, and later had a postdoctoral fellowship at King's and at the University of Cambridge. And that was around the time, I think, when I first met John, unaware that he was going to have such an enormous influence on the study and theory of politics and democracy in particular. And of course, 1989 was incredibly important in terms of John's ideas and how they were being discussed in very practical terms, which had not happened as much before. But it was at this moment when the value of his work became very obvious in a practical sense, and he got to know many of the major players in the Eastern Europe, in the revolutions in Eastern Europe in '99, and he also worked and visited Yugoslavia before and after the terrible wars of the 1990s. He's written for numerous publications. I won't list them beyond things like the New York Times and the Guardian and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on. He is incredibly prolific when it comes to writing. For a writer like myself, I find it particularly irritating, actually, that he's able to produce these books which have a huge impact year on year. The New Despotism in 2020, To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism, 2021, and The Shortest History of Democracy, 2022. I mean, that's just in the last 3 years. I'm not going to go beyond that. Absolutely ridiculous. But it is a real pleasure for us to have him here as a fellow at the IWM. I should explain that I've just arrived back from London, where I had a COVID booster jab and a flu jab, and I'm beginning to collapse internally. So I'm going to sneak off in a minute and take to my bed, but I didn't want to miss this opportunity to welcome John Keane in particular, because he really is a very special guest. With incredible alacrity and kindness, Lutger Hagedorn, our permanent fellow here, has agreed to step in to do the moderating where I would no longer be capable. And Lutger will be in conversation with John and then taking questions from the floor. But before then, I'm going to ask John to take the podium and tell us about greening democracy. John.
Thank you very much, Misha. I'm so sorry that you're not feeling well, but it may be that after I've delivered this talk, you will find that you're better off in bed. Schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich bin sehr froh und sehr geehrt, hier am IWM zu sein. Herzlichen Dank für die Einladung und besonderer Dank geht an Herrn Franz Graf für Ihre Unterstützung. Franz put up with me for nearly 3 years to try to get me from near Antarctica to Vienna. Ladies and gentlemen, it's no news to you that as we gradually ruin our planet, the subject of green politics weighs heavily on corporations, governments, mainstream media platforms, citizens, and their representatives. The greening of politics, as I'm going to call it, it runs much deeper, I want to say, than public talk of sustainability or climate justice. It's more consequential than the price talk of disputes about the price of carbon or the merits of nuclear power or of a Green New Deal or emissions trading schemes. Public awareness that humans are the only terrestrials ever to have occupied the entire planet is rising. There are controversies, as you know, about the Anthropocene, a new geological era, so-called, or the Capitalocene, or the Thulocene. These words are circulating publicly. There is a new literature which teaches us that worker bees do waggle dances, Thomas Seeley's book, or that chimpanzees are the honest politicians we all long for, which is Frans de Waal's claim, or Suzanne Simard's view that trees care for each other just like us. There is also, I think, as part of this greening of politics, the entry, rather on an unprecedented scale, of geophysics and biochemistry and other sciences. So we learn about Milankovitch cycles, or we learn about carbon cycles, David Archer, or we learn from the Polish geologist Jan Zalasiewicz that the Earth will look very different without us, and so forth. This is a period in which, philosophically speaking, there is rising interest in, for example, critical animal studies, in feminist care ethics, in capability approaches. And it's also a period, I think, in which there are calls to slow down decision-making, something like a call for slow democracy. And of course, there are disputes, tactical and strategic disputes, about how best to counter this destruction of the biosphere in which we dwell. For instance, whether priority should be given to Zadist extinction-style rebellions, or whether it's better to try to form green political parties. And if there are green political parties, whether these parties should form alliances with other parties, and questions about whether green parties and how green parties can be kept responsive to their members. It's in this period, I think, of the greening of politics that, by and large, generally speaking, democracy is taken for granted. There are those who would like to retreat from our world and to enjoy a life of harmony with nature. But this, I think, is currently exceptional. And the attachment to democracy is, I think, revealed by the outcry of James Lovelock's famous interview several years ago, in which he likened our period to a period in which emergency rule is necessary, that, as he put it, it might well be necessary to place democracy on hold for a while. This kind of remark bred all kinds of vigorous reactions, including the reaction of the German futurologist Stefan Ramler, who is currently the IZT director in Berlin. "I'd rather perish democratically," said Ramler, "than put up with a dictatorship that enforces sustainability." What I want to suggest tonight is that actually this attachment to democracy is rather shallow, that the question of why people who have green sympathies should embrace democracy for more than tactical reasons is unclear. Why should democracy, a rather anthropocentric, indeed the most anthropocentric political ideal known to humanity, how it could be compatible with democratic principles of power sharing, how it can be greened, how all of this affects the spirit of democracy. These are matters that I think remain rather obscure within green circles and beyond, or so I want to say. My opening idea is that the greening of politics that's going on, that never happened before in the history of democracy, is triggered by what physicists would call a moment of dark energy. That is to say, the universe of meaning of democracy is undergoing a dramatic expansion. In defiance of all the moaning and groaning about democracy that's going on, something very of major historical importance is happening. It is, so to say, a dramatic expansion in defiance of the cosmic gravity of worldly events, to stick with the physicist's term. And what I want to suggest is that this greening of politics, talk of green democracy, is much more consequential and more profound than the kind of development of democracy with adjectives that took place, say, in the 19th century, when phrases like Christian democracy or social democracy or liberal democracy were invented. What is going on is much more than a question of vocabulary. And I would want to say to you that democracy, the green politics of our time, requires fresh political thinking about democracy, to understand better its, the historical importance of what is happening and why it is that this period is of great significance. In what follows, I want to try to make a modest contribution to the greening of the democratic imagination. I want to do this by making three moves. I want, first of all, to talk, it's not done often, I want to talk about energy regimes, the history of energy regimes, and the way that they are connected to changing historical forms of democracy. That's one thing. I want to do something that would be difficult perhaps to do in Berlin, but can be done in Wien. I want to speak about Martin Heidegger, and I want to talk about Heidegger's thinking. And thirdly, I want to say a few things about the topic of representation. I want to introduce to you the concept of monitory democracy, and I want to suggest that the greening of politics has a great deal to do with this monitory democracy, a form of democracy that was born of the late 1940s, a form of democracy which, roughly put, means nothing less than free and fair elections, but something much more, the building of institutions that monitor, scrutinize power wherever it is exercised and seek to restrain its abuse. So three themes. First, energy regimes. Every society, we are told by historians and others, is embedded in an energy regime of one kind or another. What is an energy regime? It's the sum total of arrangements whereby energy is extracted from human or animal muscle power, or harvested, say, from running water, or sun, or tides, or wind, or coal, or uranium atoms. Energy that's then applied, stored, bought, and sold, used to fuel machines, or wasted and eventually dissipated. What I want to suggest, it should be obvious, is that every energy regime has strongly shaping effects on political and social dynamics in any historical period. An energy regime is not just a set of technological tools that can be picked up and put down at will. Energy regimes actually produce path dependencies. They have strongly structuring effects on social and political arrangements. They have power effects. They even enter the language that people speak at any point. So, for example, metaphors such as electrifying, or it's a gas, or switched on, or bright spark, or carbon footprint. These kinds of words are related to particular energy regimes, and they enter into the everyday lives of people. If we ask the question, okay, so what is the relationship between this abstract concept of energy regimes and democracies understood historically, roughly the picture that I want to draw goes like this. The ancient assembly democracies of, say, the Greek world, the Athenian is the best known, were labor-intensive forms of democracy. That is, the main source of energy of these assembly democracies was muscle power. Slavery was intrinsic to these democracies, supplemented with some animal energy, oxen, donkeys, mules, horses, sail power, by which warships were moved across the seas, and so on and so forth. This was a period, these assembly democracies based upon muscle power, were democracies in which we could say demogenesis, the creation of a people, depended heavily on slavery. Male citizens were enfranchised increasingly, and they were the ones who were the laboring men. It is an interesting question, I have no time to go through it, as to what the environmental impact of this muscle power, slave-based polities were. What environmental impacts did they have? There are great disputes about this, but one can say that these assembly democracies were committed to self-sufficiency. They were committed to the primacy of politics and not economics. Commodity production and exchange was politically curtailed. It was embedded and not unleashed, as happened later under modern conditions. And there was also the popular belief in the deities, that the deities would take their revenge upon the misuse of environments, the abuse of, by humans of their power. A second phase in the history of democracy is the birth of what I've called electoral democracy. It's sometimes called representative democracy. What's very striking is that we have no good study of a major convergence, a major coincidence that happened towards the end of the 18th century. That was the period in the Atlantic region where the very phrase representative democracy was born. Democracy came to mean a form of self-government of people in a territorial state setting where there were periodic elections, where representatives were chosen by the people. It's important to note that the assembly democracies in ancient Greece, there was no word for representation in the classical Greek language. This is an entire reimagining of democracy. And what's striking, but under-researched, hardly researched at all, is that coincided with a shift from non-carbon to carbon energy regimes. This is a very long story, but we could say that demogenesis, the creation of a people who have the vote, who are entitled to govern themselves through their elected representatives, demogenesis underwent a kind of carbonization. And it happened in two phases. First, the adoption and use of coal, and then, of course, later, oil and gas. This carbon-based energy regime had tremendously powerful effects, as we know, on such industries as the invention and manufacturing of aircraft, of automobiles. This carbon energy regime enabled the invention of fertilizers, petrochemicals, plastics, gasoline-powered chainsaws, trucks, tractors, bulldozers, lawnmowers. You are all very familiar with this. And of course, there was in this convergence of electoral democracy and carbon-based energy regimes lots of decadent effects. If you read Dickens, you will read about coke towns, that in the age of parliamentary democracy developing, there was tremendous environmental pollution from this new carbon-based energy regime. I'm giving you, in just a few minutes, a very quick kangaroo hop through the history of democracy, and I come to the third historical phase. I think in the 1940s, when the last great discussion of the future of democracy happened, something new was born. I call it monitory democracy. I've never found a way of translating it into German. In other languages it works, but to repeat, a new historical form of democracy in which self-government of the people through their chosen representatives is supplemented with the growth of all kinds of new institutions that never existed in the history of democracy, some of which are based upon unelected representation of peoples. I'm thinking of bodies such as anti-corruption commissions, citizens' juries, truth and reconciliation forums, participatory budgeting, intergenerational panels. I mean, these mechanisms for representing peoples, for restraining abuses of power, never existed before in the history of democracy. And to this list of monitory institutions has to be added, uniquely to the age of monitory democracy, green parties, bioregional assemblies, government, local government covenants, citizen science projects like the Opal project in the UK, global agreements such as the Aarhus Convention, daring multimedia insurgencies such as the Zadistes, who I've mentioned before, whose slogan, "We're not defending nature, we are nature defending itself." It's these kinds of innovations, including lots of cultural experimentation. David Attenborough's Blue Planet 2, for instance. It's these kinds of innovations that are taking place in the era of monitory democracy. And it is, it seems to me, important to think about the implications of the growth of these green monitoring mechanisms, networks, organizations, and so on, and the way that they impact upon democracy and actually, I'm going to suggest to you, change its meaning. Second, I want to speak a little bit about Martin Heidegger, because one of the striking things about this era of monitory democracy is the growth of philosophical reflections. I would say new philosophical reflections with immense public importance about our relationship with what is and has been and still is called nature. I'm not sure if any of you have looked at Heidegger. It's not an easy read. In particular, his works after becoming persona non grata, given his sympathies for Hitler, the writings after 1945 until his death are extremely interesting, and they are, for me, the opening shot, so to say, in philosophical arguments about what are we going to do about our destruction of biomes, how should we live, how should we live, how should we dwell on Earth. Well, the broad themes go something like this. You will see that I'm strongly critical of Heidegger, but we need to understand the thesis that he puts on the table. After 1945, he insists that we have entered the period, after a long history of this, of what he calls total control, Machenschaft. I mean, everything is subject to techniques of measurement, mechanization, and total control. There are many passages in these writings of the late 40s, 1950s, and 60s, when he is living in his Hütte in Bavaria, that are striking. The world, I'm quoting now, appears as an object open to the attacks of calculative thought, attacks that nothing is believed able any longer to resist. Nature becomes a gigantic gasoline station, an energy source for modern technology and industry. He goes on to say that modern technology, a term he uses as a synonym for a whole way of life, a Gestell, as he put it, is geared to ordering and seizing the habitats in which we dwell. And as a consequence, people lose contact with their earthly habitats. We become homeless, uprooted. The biosphere, as he puts it, is set upon. And running through these writings are striking similes. I quote, "The old wooden bridge that joined bank with bank for hundreds of years, and the old windmill whose sails were left entirely to the wind's blowing, are replaced by the human will to power over nature. The earth now reveals itself as a coal mining district, the soil as a mineral deposit." So what is to be done about this? Well, to put it very simply, Heidegger recommends the return to some new form of meditative reflection, as he puts it. There needs to be an openness to mystery. We need to develop a kind of releasement towards beings on our planet. He calls it Gelassenheit. In other words, humans need to cultivate a sense of fruitfully being rooted within a biosphere that must be respected and protected, not dominated. A kind of new rootedness that sometimes he calls, using a very old-fashioned German word, Bodenständigkeit. The idea is that we hereon must strive to live poetically on earth, to use another one of his favorite phrases. Unfortunately, in my view, Heidegger here, I think, made a fetish of poiesis, as the classical Greeks called it. That is to say, the idea that our task is to live on earth and poetically to dwell on earth. This, for Heidegger, is the primary way of handling this domination of humans, of themselves and nature. Living poetically on earth becomes his master solution to what we now call an environmental crisis. What is clear, I think, is that this whole formula of Heidegger involves a rejection of democracy. Why did he show no sympathy for, and indeed hostility to, democracy? Partly the view that should be talked about is that in the early 1930s, in a seminar series, he was an open fascist. He spoke about the people, das Volk, and he spoke about the being of the people as the foundation of the good state. The good state is a manifestation of the power of the people. It's a fascist way of thinking. This should be borne in mind. It's one reason why he was not in favor of monitory democracy. And there's also the view that of Heidegger that democracy is riddled with calculative thinking. It makes a fetish of measurement, public opinion polling, one person, one vote. It seems to me that this critique of democracy is compounded in the case of Heidegger by the way that local community assemblies, he had a certain Greek tendency. He called them die Weserei. It's a very old-fashioned word to describe local peoples deciding for themselves things. Modern representative democracy destroys this, or so Heidegger argues. So the culmination of this way of thinking is in, of course, the famous Der Spiegel interview, which was published posthumously, in which he says that democracy, he has reflected on democracy, but he says, quote, "How can a political system accommodate itself to the technological age? And which political system would this be?" His answer, "I have no answer to this question. I am not convinced, however, that it is democracy." Well, I come third and finally to a further consideration of what I'm calling monitory democracy. Many call it liberal democracy. It can be called a variety of things. I choose this not very poetic phrase. And I want to talk about representation, the importance of representation, and why Heidegger was wrong. Here, of course, it should be remembered once again that Heidegger was no political angel, that he ended his life in a kind of apolitical disillusionment, and for a time he supported the Nazis, whom he foolishly expected to break the mold of standardization of technology. Here, I want only to say, against this backdrop, that Heidegger failed to recognize democracy's punk quality. Punk quality. I mean by this that when monitory democracy takes root, when it works well, then it is a form of handling power whose spirit sharpens people's understanding of the contingency of the power relations in which they dwell. Monitory democracy nurtures a shared sense of the time-bounded quality of our being in the world. It enables people and encourages them to see each other as equals and to question and reject manipulative arbitrary power, to struggle against what Heidegger generally called technology. I've tried to show in various writings that this insurgent, this disruptor, these punk dynamics of democracy are amplified by the practices of representation. Once again, ancient assembly democracies did not practice representation. They had no word for it. It is the invention of what Thomas Jefferson called government democratical but representative, in a famous letter of 1816, the invention of representative democracy at the end of the 18th century changed the meaning of both democracy and representation. We could say that it was had greater impact than that of making the case for periodic elections. It did something much more radical, did this government democratical but representative. It sharpened awareness that we humans are representing animals. This, I think, is an awareness that is growing in the era of monitory democracy. Bruno Latour, who sadly is no longer with us, once remarked that the great thing about the invention of democratic representation is that it put on the agenda not only slogans such as no taxation without representation, but, as he put it, no reality without representation. That is, it heightened our sense that we are representing animals, that we chronically, within a language framework, within any context, make claims to other people about the world of objects around us. We regularly do this, and this is part of and bound up with the transformation of democracy. Its most heightened form is monetary democracy, in which representation of peoples and their interests becomes more and more bound up with representation of the biomes in which they dwell. Representation, to remind you, is not mimesis. In an election, the gap between represented and representatives is always there. One reason for having elections is that elections are opportunities to throw paper rocks or electronic stones at representatives who are considered to have done a bad job. What I want to say is that representation, abstractly put, is not mimesis. It's a dynamic, open-ended, contingent relationship of substitution. Representation has a vicarious quality, a stellvertreter quality, we could say. The representative portrays the world in a certain way, portrays his or her performance in a certain way, and this is subject to contestation when representation works well. Representation is thus subject to what I've called in my writings contestation and the disappointment principle. One reason for having elections is that disappointment is always a possibility, and when there is disappointment, those bastards are thrown out onto the streets. I emphasize this question of representation and its dynamics because, in my view, I come to the final part of what I want to say to you. My view is that I emphasize these dynamics of representation because too many green-minded scholars and activists who are engaged in what Pierre Bourdieu calls classification struggles downplay the importance of representation, or they ignore it entirely. One can see this in the fashionable trend towards deliberative democracy. I could give the example of an Australian, Tim Flannery, who, in a book called Here on Earth, published a decade ago, says that basically the significance of green politics is that it reminds us of the necessity of producing decision-making processes, quote, by the people, of the people, for the people. I mean, in my view, this is, he's Greek. He wants somehow to return to the age of assembly democracies. You can also see this neglect of representation, for instance, in the work of Donna Haraway. I like very much her pioneering efforts to defend what she calls tentacular thinking in what she calls the Thulacine age. It's an unspellable noun that probably will never catch on publicly. But what she wants to say is that it is important in this time to cause, in this era, to cause trouble, to emphasize that human beings are with and of the earth. She wants to get us used to worlding, as she puts it, to unleash non-arrogant collaboration, to practice pulling back and scaling down, to maximize our capacity for imagining and caring for other worlds. She wants to recognize Gaia and to see that Gaia is a fearful and devastating power, a maker and a destroyer. We are all lichens, she concludes, so we can be scraped off the rocks by the Furies who still erupt to avenge crimes against the earth. Well, what I think is going on here is a kind of denial, actually, of the arbitrariness of the representations of our relationship with the earth. That is to say, a downplaying of the context-dependent, arbitrary representations of this relationship, the language games that are played, the variable language games that are played. In other words, there's a kind of trompe-l'oeil effect at work here. Representation is hidden away. It's as if her representation of the world has a totemic quality. More generally, those who speak about Gaia, who speak about the Capitalocene, who speak about multi-species justice, who speak about animal rights and so on, are all engaged in games of representation. And that, I think, is of fundamental importance to democratic politics to recognize this. But in so many of these contributions in this era, the representational qualities of representation are hidden away. And what's left is a kind of weird, politically unclassifiable nonconformity, I would say. Lots of undefined we's. I mean, we are this and we are that. The we is never defined. Or there is some flirtation of a version of technocratic administration which, filled with impatience, is going to decide what's right and what must be done to avoid a catastrophe, an environmental catastrophe. So I move to my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. This neglect, this maltreatment of representation, of the theme of representation, of the processes, the phenomenon of representation is regrettable. Because, if I'm right, we are living in times in which there is an unprecedented stretching of democratic forms of political representation to include the biosphere. This is among the most remarkable novelties of our age of representative democracy. Of course, it has to be said that other terrestrials cannot speak and act for themselves in any human sense. The biosphere cannot enjoy rights. To do so would require it to observe sets of duties. But our biomes can be publicly represented in human affairs. If we want to stick with Heidegger's language, our biomes can be coaxed into appearance. Non-human nature can be brought forth from concealment into unconcealment, as Heidegger said. Hervorbringen is one of the effects of representation. But contrary to Heidegger, representations of our earth are neither a covert form of attempted mastery of nature nor submission to its aesthetic beauty, which was his choice. Political representation defies this Heideggerian distinction. It's a special dynamic relationship through which humans limit and restrain their own will to master the biosphere by offering to protect and nurture the non-human nature to which they belong. Put differently, representation is a fiduciary relationship. It is a treuhänderisch relationship. That is to say, the representation of non-human nature recognizes that non-human nature is voiceless. It can't speak and act for itself. Though it can wither, it can strike back, as we've seen in the COVID-19 era, or it can die when maltreated by humans. As fiduciaries, humans are charged with prudently representing the biomes in which they dwell. And this self-restraint has profound implications, I put it to you, for the way we think about and imagine and practice democracy. Democracy, with the extension of representation mechanisms to our relationship with biomes, representation and democracy are greened. This greening of democracy, I think, desanctifies the human versus nature dualism. It also, we could say, democratizes democracy. What do I mean? Green politics enriches not only and redefines the meaning of representation, it also helps to rid the whole idea of democracy of its anthropocentrism. To repeat, democracy, as I see it, is a carrier of species narcissism. What could be more narcissistic than the presumption that the people are entitled as sovereigns on the earth to decide for themselves how they will be governed and how they dwell on the earth? It follows from this that the new green politics, in my view, does more than urge humans to return to earth, as Bruno Latour recommended, to reimagine ourselves as humble beings deeply entangled in the ecosystems in which we dwell and on which we depend. here is the key point. This greening of politics, this development of monitory democratic mechanisms renders power publicly accountable, yes, but what it does is put an end to the orthodox view, the foolish and scandalous idea that the people are the ultimate source of sovereign power and authority on planet Earth. I think this is enough. Herzlichen Dank. And I sit down.
Thank you so much, John, for this, I might say, electrifying talk. You made use of this metaphor before. Thanks for that. You gave us the full panorama of if I would use the title of your book, The Shortest History of Democracy. What you gave to us today is a bit of the shortest history of ecological democracy and greening democracy, from the human hybris and the revenge of the gods in the antiquity to the highly technicized energy regimes of our days, with a short stop in between at some remote hut in the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald. It's in Baden. Heidegger was looking at us from over there, from these grayish books. We have a lot of Heidegger here. He was very close to you. I'll start with a couple of just short remarks, short questions before I open up to all of you. You're invited to take part in this discussion. I'll just try to give it a short start. You have made very many critical remarks yourself about exactly the combination of democracy and greening it, or its ecological qualities. You have spoken about the obscure, as you said, this is the word you used, the obscure aspects of green politics. So there is a lot of warnings in your talk that we have all listened to. Nevertheless, I think you are going for democracy, and you're somehow convinced that democracy is the regime that is best fit to solve these problems. Provocatively, I would say any dictatorial rule is probably better apt to deal with problems that we have clearly understood. We know what to do. We have a dictatorial regime. We can force people to save energy, for example. It seems to be so obvious that any other rule is better fit to deal with such problems than precisely democracy. I think this is the point where one thing comes in that you call the punk quality of democracy. I was maybe I did not fully understand it. Maybe I'm not fully convinced. Maybe you can give us a bit more of the idea of what this punk quality is and why precisely democracy is apt to deal with ecological problems.
Yeah, just a small question.
Yes, as always.
Okay, big talk generates small questions that are actually very profound. I think just two things briefly. I think if we think about democracy in our times, if we think about it as monitory democracy, so there are free and fair elections regularly, and there is the ongoing public scrutiny and attempted restraint of arbitrary exercises of power, whether in the household or local communities or in workplaces or in government and or in business, then the functional advantage is when it comes to matters of our relationship with the earth. The functional advantage of democracy in this sense is that it is an institutionalized learning system. Monetary democracy is a whole, as it were, ecology of warning signals, of announcements, of representations of things that are going wrong, and a signaling of those problems to those who take decisions. The absence of a civil society, the absence of public monitoring institutions, the short supply of monitoring institutions is a feature of all of the new despotisms. And one can believe in good kings and queens, in good rulers, One can believe that in emergency situations, rulers will always get things right. They know what is to be done. But I submit that it's a wager. I submit that these regimes are weakened in their capacity to deal with ecological problems, loosely put. And this is a functional advantage of monetary democracies wherever that exists, in Chile or in South Africa, in the European Union, in New Zealand, Australia, in Canada, and so on. There's also, secondly, I think, the advantage that this is a period, it's a more philosophical point, this is a period in which something like bricoleurs, as the French say, are needed. I mean, what we need, what is good is to have a plurality of perspectives, of representations, a multiplication of representations of what our problems are and how we can reimagine ourselves beyond this dualism between society and nature. I mean, I tried to give a voice, so to say, to many of those representations, Donna Haraway or Latour, or let's say, you know, climate emissions, trading schemes, and so on. I mean, all of these are, I would say, normatively desirable. When you have a despotic system of power without free and multiple communications, media platforms, it's much more difficult to circulate these. Instead, what one hears is talk of ecological civilization. This is Xi Jinping. One hears some talk of this in Russia. One hears talk of this in Vietnam, in Saudi. You know, the greening of the Saudi economy, the most petro-based, one of the most petro-based economies. There's a lot of talk of an environmental issue, but there is a serious normative shortage of perspectives that seem to me to be in this period of great ethical importance. So there are two doubts that I have about strong top-down rulership, despotic rule, and its technical capacity to achieve miracles on earth. I mean, historians are going to tell us whether I'm wrong or you are right, but this would be roughly the first moves I would make. Of course, yes.
It was not necessarily an opinion, but I just wanted to hear. Let's stay with this point. Let's stay with the relation of nature and democracy. Let's say we are convinced now that democracy is the political system to best deal with these problems. Nevertheless, we have a lot of smaller, very nasty problems popping up there. You have this great differentiation, the three stages: the assembly democracy, the electoral democracy, and the what you call monetary democracy. Monetary democracy is about very many things. It is about institutions that do not necessarily have to do with the government, but with civil society, and so on and so on. But the main thing about speaking about ecological aspects is that your understanding of monetary democracy is not only about a government of people for the people, but it is also the attempt to include nature.
Yes.
We have a problem here because obviously nature cannot vote. Nature does not have a voice. Who is the one who represents nature?
Okay.
Who is the one to speak for nature? What is the role of scientists? And I mean, you also had this already in your lecture. You had this great quote of "We are not defending nature. We are nature defending itself." This is what about me saying this is just another human hybris that you pretend you can speak for nature, what nature wants, what nature deserves. So how to build this into a democratic rule?
Well, another excellent and rather small question.
Yes.
I think, first of all, if I'm right in my description, if there's something to my description of monetary democracy as the multiplication of sites of representation, Latour called them parliaments of things, then the check and balance that is part of that system is a dampener, it is a restraining dynamic for any one of these narratives to become big and dominant. And so there is a kind of humility or a humbling that goes on when monetary democracies function well, because there is a competition among, there are alliances between, etc., but there's give and take. There is an awareness that that reality is itself represented, and there's a competition over what is reality. This is one restraining, so to say, humbling dynamic. The other is that when groups, organizations, blow the whistle, when they portray an exercise of power as destructive of our biomes, they are engaged in, yes, unelected representation. Very often they're not chosen by anybody. I'll give you an example. If you ask Martin Winterkorn, the former CEO of Volkswagen, about this dynamic, he now understands very well that Dieselgate 2015 is a sort of textbook case of monetary democracy in action. What happens? So Volkswagen does its official tests, and it says that its emissions are within the guidelines of California and so on. And a research group of scientists in Virginia begins to do their own testing. And what do they discover? They discover that actually Volkswagen is governed by cheats. They cheated. And so they pass their reports to the Department of Environment and so on. Major legal cases happen. Winterkorn is removed, and it has cost Volkswagen a great deal of money. If you think about that dynamic, it is one in which there were not periodic elections, at the university in Virginia. There's certainly not periodic elections inside Volkswagen. And yet, a group stood forward of scientists to say that actually this narrative is based on a lie. It's bullshit. And therefore, there needs to be public discussion about this, and something needs to be done. Well, this, when monetary democracies work well, happens chronically. Is this, to come immediately to your question, is this Volkswagen Dieselgate an example of hubris, of human hubris? I think not. I think that there's a growing repertoire of incidents of this kind, of scandals of this kind, where actually the dynamic is not, the will to human superiority, as Heidegger would have said, but it is the opposite. It is calling into question humans' titanism, as Patočka and others called it. This belief that humans are capable of doing anything on Earth, and to do so under democratic conditions. Well, maybe I'm dreaming, but it does seem to me, after having spent a very sad life writing, doing nothing else, writing and broadcasting about democracy, past, present, and future, it does seem to me that something big is going on. And for all the talk of backsliding and, crisis of democracy and the end of democracy, we should take it seriously. This is one area, it seems to me, in which actually there is a remarkable reimagining going on of what democracy is and how it is that we can get beyond this presumption that we're, masters and possessors of nature. And a lot of this is going on at city level. These are laboratories, it seems to me, of the reinvigoration of democracy, of monetary democracy. And without this, it would look really like a much darker, bleak dynamic.
As I said before, your concept of monetary democracy is a much broader one. It is not just fit for the question of ecology, and I want to make use of the opportunity that we have you here, as Misha Glenny said at the beginning, one of the greatest scholars on democracy. So I'll take one step back from the question of ecology and just ask you about monetary democracy as your concept. The monetary democracy, as you understand it, is not just a democracy that takes place during elections, but it is an understanding of democracy that has to do with very many other entities. I would not even call it institutions, but entities. Investigative journalism maybe is one thing to be mentioned. Public opinion polls, the role of NGOs, etc., etc. These are the features of a democratic society in the sense of the monetary democracy. Once again, a heretic. You know, you mentioned Patočka. His most famous book is Theoretical Essays. So I'll ask another heretic question. How do we know about the impact of these non-governmental institutions, of all these entities, as I called them in the beginning, on democratic decision making? Can we ever measure it? Can we say what it is? And if we do the reality check, why, if we have such societies, and I guess we are living in such a society as you describe it, why then so very often does it fail? Because we see very, very setbacks everywhere. How to deal with these like inherent contradictions or maldevelopments?
Very tiny question.
Yes, once again.
I think, I mean, it's a long discussion and probably another session, but it does seem to me if we confine our discussion to the greening of politics that I was describing tonight, that actually there have been very major advances in the sense that the early warning detectors, the multiplication of early warning detectors is going on. These early warning detectors have taken roots, and they have happened in my lifetime. If I think about a book like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, you know, this book caused a sensation for saying something new, which is that the growing reliance of agriculture on fertilizers is destroying insects and destroying birds and destroying whole ecosystems, and we need to put a stop to that. So again, this may be wishful thinking, but just descriptively, it seems to me that the proliferation of these monitoring bodies of various forms operating often across borders are very major, are having very major effects on politics. They keep alive politics. If politics is the process whereby peoples on earth decide who gets what, when, and how, and do so non-violently, then this greening of politics is contributing to its enrichment, its renewal, its redefinition. Perhaps just one last word on this unusual, unorthodox, troublemaking phrase, monetary democracy. The German translation is impossible. Several years ago, I thought it would be Beobachtende Demokratie, only to discover that the Nazis had a newspaper in 1926 or something, so I quickly drew back from that, thinking, this is not right. There are some languages, democracia monitorizada in Spanish, where everybody knows what you're talking about. You know, a form of democracy where there is ongoing public scrutiny and restraint of power. And just one, very briefly, one biographical note here. When I was writing my history of democracy, the long version, I became very puzzled at the arguments that took place in the 1940s globally in India as much as in Europe, as in North America and Latin America. Because, and the new institutions that were born of that period, like human rights networks, or Mitbestimmung, or written constitutions that could trump, no pun intended, the behavior of governments. That was a decade in which the reasoning across the political spectrum was from left, George Orwell, to say Jacques Maritain on the right, and liberals in the center. It was a period in which there was, from my readings, there is no great book about this period, in which across the spectrum there was the conviction that free elections could be corrupted by the Hitlers of this world. That a majority in the name of das Volk could come to power and it could then destroy democracy. And so the reasoning was, in this period, what was needed was new institutions that could check and balance and prevent that. That, to me, is, it was a paradigm shift. It's a major reimagining of democracy. One sentence more, will it survive? I have no idea. There are times when I think it's done for. I mean, you know, it will be destroyed. And one, this is a long sentence, one of the major threats to it is the resurgence of this new populism, because one thing it doesn't like is the public checking and balancing and scrutinizing of power. That is why they want to get their hands on courts. That is why they want to politicize civil service. That is why they want to tell scientists to shut up. That's why they call journalists prostitutes, Modi. And that's why, in the name of the people, they want to win elections and concentrate power. In my view, you know, pushing actually existing democracies towards despotic rule. And the pattern is that these populists are not interested in this discussion that I tried to summarize tonight. I think Latour put it very well in his last book when talking about Trump. It's like, well, let's draw up the bridges, let's pump that oil and gas, we'll all be dead in 40 years, but for the time being, let's just get on with it and enjoy everything. That, I think, is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's kind of how the new populists of this world think. And it's not only disgraceful, but it's suicidal, one could say.
Thanks, John. This is maybe the moment to have your views. Ivan, please. Would you wait for the mic?
Yeah. No, I'm going.
No, for the stream.
Thank you very much for the interesting conversation. And here the question which was coming from Ludger was, are you sure that greening of politics is good? Democracy is the best way. Now I'm going to ask you the other question. Do you believe that greening of politics is good for democracy? You put a very strong pressure on us. Basically, I now feel that I should represent animals. And this is important, but this believes that I know what they want. And one of the major importance about democracy is this equality of experience. I believe that I know best what is good for me. And I could be totally wrong. But democracy is about representation. Can you represent something which you do not understand? And if you can represent something that you do not understand, why then a dictator cannot represent me? And I'm asking this because democracy is based on the limited nature of my experience. Limited also on Earth. I'm not living on Earth. I'm living just here around. And from this point of view, the moment you're enlarging it, you can create a problem of the erosion of the idea of representation, in which basically the election cycles. On one level, I understand what you're doing, and I do believe it's very noble. And my last point is on monitoring. You're totally right that populists don't like monitoring institutions, but on the other side, modern autocracies does. China likes monitoring institutions because it's much more based on science, it's based even anti-corruption watchdogs and others, because it is a form of checking on power, but this is basically not an instrument for contesting power. And from this point of view, I want to ask you this question. To what extent you are not afraid that enlarging so much the idea of representation, you make my vote kind of strange one?
Well, thank you very much, Ivan. I could say that when you popped out, I provided an answer to your question, but this is a cheap remark. Yeah, I think there's a bundle of questions there. First of all, I find myself here on the side of all people, Edmund Burke, who, the great Irish, Anglo-Irish politician and writer, who, when reflecting on representation, said, repeated often that it has a vicarious dimension, that the representative makes claims on behalf of others who are silent, at least for a time. And he thought that there were multiple advantages of that. So even in the practice of elections, of periodic elections, there are moments, often extended moments, when the represented don't speak. So it's not true that that representative government is a dynamic in which there is constant talking to and fro. This is not true. The second, rather linked to Burke point, is that I have tried to write about unelected representation. And I think it deserves, we don't have good political thinking enough about it, and I don't have time to explain exactly what this phrase, it sounds oxymoronic. But let me give you an example. If we think about the role that Archbishop Desmond Tutu played in South Africa during the transition, he chose deliberately to stay out of electoral politics. And yet millions of South Africans regarded him as a representative of goodness, of virtue, of course he's a Christian, of justice, etc., etc. And that's a great paradox, but just empirically, it seems to me that that phenomenon of unelected representation is one of the features of this era of monitory democracy. Now, of course, it contains within it the possibility of abuse. But thirdly, I think the emphasis that I placed on representation in the wider sense of its Merleau-Ponty, it could be Wittgenstein, ask all the semioticians, the language game analysts, that what I wanted to say is that we are representing animals. We use language symbols within context to make claims about things. And we make those claims often without any feedback. We say that Trump is a monster. He doesn't reply, but we make these claims of representation. And it seems to me, therefore, that there is nothing inherently, for me, autodestructive about saying that a forest or a river is entitled to have legal entitlements to, in other words, that it should enjoy protection. This is, of course, a New Zealand innovation. Or that the constitutions of Mongolia, Bhutan, Slovenia have within them clauses that say to be a citizen is to have a fiduciary relationship with the biomes in which you dwell. If you're a citizen, you do not destroy so-called nature. So I think, if I may put it in this slightly comical way, I think reality is on my side and less on yours, in that we're witnessing the multiplication of forms of representation, and their plurality, their multiplicity is not a bad thing. I'm, of course, a dogmatic pluralist. And it does seem to me that, finally, that continuing to speak of nature as a bunch of objects out there, objects that we should conquer, mine, extract resources from, it remains the orthodoxy that this way of thinking about nature, well, is bringing ruinous effects to our planet. And I think democratic politics is now caught up in that drama, and I think it's, what I tried to make a case for tonight is that democratic politics is a fruitful, politically fruitful way of handling this problem. About despotisms, yes, as you know, I have a deep interest in China, and I can report to you that, yes, those who rule at all levels in China are aware of the parable that when trees fall, monkeys scatter. It's the title of one of my books. I mean, there's a certain skittishness of power. This is not a replication of the Soviet model. It's much cleverer, and it does build in to the structures of government at all levels, monitoring devices, public opinion, online forums. The party at all levels uses public opinion polling agencies to help decide how to act. There are participatory budgeting experiments, et cetera, et cetera. Why do they do this? Because they know that the rulers at all levels, the party knows, that naked hubristic power can quickly be destroyed. It's got to win the people's loyalty. And so instituted, so to say, in these regimes are these learning or monetary mechanisms. In the Arab Emirates, there are happiness forums. In Vietnam, there are watchdog bodies for spotting, local disturbances. These are also regimes, as in China, where actually digital network communications, although heavily censored, are used by the authorities to spot trouble. And yet, despite all of that, my insistence is that these systems are marked by shortages of monetary democracy, and it seems to me it's their great weakness.
John, looking at the time, I suggest we shift it to one more round of questions. Maybe we can collect two or three, and you'll try to answer all of them.
Sure.
Is this working? Yeah. Yeah, there were so many interesting things in your talk to pull out from. It's difficult to choose, but I was very interested in the idea that representation isn't mimicry, on the one hand, and then this in relation to your critique of we as nature, this idea that we somehow are symbiotic with nature, and therefore ecofeminism allows us to we position ourselves very closely to nature in that respect. So your criticism there. So the two things, like representation not being mimicry, and we as nature as a sort of like false ideal. And what I'm interested to know a little bit more about is this punk position. So if we actually, within a democratic sense, do take more responsibility and say, okay, yes, we are nature as such, we are beings, but we can't just stand back and sort of not involve ourselves in a kind of responsible way to take action in this monitoring sense. Could you enlighten a bit more on this idea of the punks? Like, what is this punk position then? Is a punk position a responsible position?
Another question.
Thank you. You are the author of the
first serious biography of Václav Havel. Yeah. So I would like to ask you, what was the most interesting thing in Havel's thinking in 70s, 80s for you, and is it still relevant in this context of this discussion and in our times?
Thank you. Another one?
I have a very simple question for me. It was really enlightening also, your talk. But I was thinking about this division between society and nature, and how do we think about the nature, and how the democracy should be more green to we take more connection with the earth into account. But is there really some difference between thinking about the nature and human beings? Because I think that also human beings are more and more, even in a democratic system, perceived just as a resources. You know, every company has human resources, and I just don't think that if we are not possible to change this perceiving of human beings in the democratic system, to see people in a different way than just resource, how could we change thinking and making our policy which is directed to the nature?
Very much.
Maybe.
Last one, or? Oh, there is one here. I have a long piece of paper. Yeah.
So also thank you for the lecture. Just a short question could be helpful when you spoke about representative democracy, about what is the relation between representative democracy and the notion of self-determination. Because I appreciate quite a lot that you criticize Heidegger and this ancient democracy precisely for this inability to come up with this notion of self-determination. Because in ancient times, or also in, let's say, in the National Socialism, it is the nature, it is the being that determines us. So the very idea of French Revolution, the idea of self-determination is missing there. So could be helpful for you, and also the question, this is relating that democracy as a representation is not just mimic of what is present, but precisely it is the idea that it is that self-determination. It is not just mirroring of us, who are of people, but the representation, in a sense, making us, let's say, more human than we are. And it is the idea that representation, therefore, means that we are no longer just a part of nature, but precisely for this ability to determine itself, to representing ourselves. So this idea, this connection between representation and self-determination. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, herzlichen Dank for this barrage of very interesting questions, and I'll try to be brief, because I think there is Käse und Wein.
Yes,
perhaps.
it is. You have stolen my last remark.
You can still make it. Perhaps beginning with the last question, I work backwards. I mean, we should just reflect for a moment in this matter of self-determination to the core idea of democracy. I mean, it's a word that has roots older than classical Greek, I've tried to show, but in the Greek world, demokratia is the rule of the people. And what I've tried to show in my work is that this notion of popular self-determination of a people, was a very radical invention. Not tyrants, not oligarchs, not aristocrats, not the gods to rule, but people living on earth. And it remains, in my view, the most radical political ideal that we have. The notion that people who are engaged in self-determination are equals. Nobody is entitled, Alain Touraine used to say, from the democratic perspective, nobody is entitled to sit on a throne of power. But this, what I'm to say now is, I think, less obvious. In the history of democracy, this demos principle undergoes a democratization. What does this mean? Well, in the classical assemblies of the ancient Greek world, democracy meant the visible, physical presence of male citizens, the people, gathering in public, say 10 times a year, to determine how they're going to live on Earth. They take decisions by a show of hands, or they put stones in a pot to decide whether they will raise taxes or whether they will go to war or accept a peace agreement. So the demos has, and classical scholars have emphasized, the demos has a kind of unity, and it has a kind of physical manifestation. What representative democracy does, or electoral democracy from the end of the 18th century, is introduce, this is not so obvious, it introduces the idea, the principle, that the demos is not agreed with itself. I mean, classical Athenian democracy was guided by the will to unanimity. Disharmony was feared. Representative democracy introduces the idea, when you have a multi-party system, for instance, that the people are divided. The people don't agree with each other. And what I would say is that this era of monitory democracy is a further democratization of that demos principle, because it not only, when it works well, shows that there are multiple interests, multiple peoples who don't agree with each other, but that there are some peoples who will never win an election, but nevertheless need to be protected from bossing and bullying and manipulation. Indigenous peoples, for example, where I come from. But monetary democracy also democratizes the demos principle, the principle of the self-determination of the people, saying the people actually live in biomes of which they are part. I mean, think for a minute about the atmosphere we breathe. Are we separate from nature, or are we part of it? It's clear that, I think, unless you imagine that there is some kind of invisible wall between us, that breathing is an instance of our interdependence with what used to be called nature. So this whole question of the self-determination of people in the history of democracy is, for me, a process of the democratization of the demos principle. And seen in this way, populists, demagogues, at each one of these three historical phases, demagogues tried to destroy that democratization process. When Trump speaks, or Bolsonaro speaks, or Duterte spoke about the people, they have in their mind's eyes a unified fictional people that agrees, of course, the demagogue is a manifestation of this. It's very dangerous. It's deeply anti-democratic. There are three other questions, and we'll be here all night. But I would like to link just what I have said with the question about its punk quality. Maybe this is a very unhelpful simile. I first came across this thought in the writings of Tocqueville. So this French aristocrat who travels to America for over 12 months in the 1830s and the 1820s and 30s, and who writes one of the classics in the history of democracy, Démocratie en Amérique. He travels and he is struck. Because at first he doesn't like this democracy, but he's struck by this American republic. And he then becomes the anthropologist of that American republic. And one of the remarks that he makes repeatedly, and you can see this in his letters, is he's struck by the way that when the democratic revolution takes root, as he put it, then people come to see that the power relations in and through which they live are alterable. They come to see power relations as contingent, not given by God, not natural. And he gives the example of the exclusion of women in this American democracy. How is it possible, he asks, he's not the first, that more than half of the population doesn't have the vote and is considered to be an inferior of men in this republic? And he predicts that it can't last. It cannot last because those who say, Christians in particular, who say that the subordination of women, they don't even use it, that the obedience of women is natural, it's God-given, it's part of, natural household relations, this will not survive democracy. And he says much the same about the slavery question. Those who say that slavery is God-given, it is in the nature of man, that black people are inferior, more stupid, and fit only for muscle power, this will produce trouble in this democratic republic. And either the democratic republic will, like the ancients, agree that slavery is necessary for democracy, in which case it's a giant hypocrisy, or it will have to be changed, and his intuition is that big trouble is coming. Well, a civil war was fought about that question, and for the first time, on a large scale, representative democracy defeated slavery. It's not over by any means, but it defeated the ethics of slavery. So it was from Tocqueville that I began to ponder this question of democracy and its friend, contingency. It's an abstract idea, but why call it punk? Well, that's because I'm so old that I remember punk, and I actually, I was around when it happened. May it long live. And I don't mean that democracy has, wearing tartan skirts and leather and, rings and spits on the ground and uses four-letter words. What I mean is that spirit of punk in the 70s was a period in which there was a confrontation with the way that things are and an attempt to disrupt what was considered to be natural. God save the Queen fascist regime. This is outrageous. But it had the effect of arousing, its energy aroused many millions of people to see that things actually could be different than this world. I think democracy is, in this respect, to repeat, it is the carrier of the sense of the contingency of power relations. And in this sense, it remains a fugitive in our world. And it's also the reason why there is no perfect democracy, and we'll never have a perfect democracy. This is Derrida's point that caused something of a rumble. Unlike, say, socialism or pure market economies, which were dreamed up here in Wien, you never get there. There's no perfect democracy. Peoples are always chasing it around corners and upstairs and looking into blue skies. There is no perfect democracy because it is a process of questioning maldistributions of power, and above all, abuse of power, whether that is the maltreatment of women, the violation of women in households or on the streets, or whether it's bosses who treat their employees badly, or whether it's populist governments that try to manipulate institutions to their advantage. About Václav Havel, briefly, I think that my own greening, I have to say, was influenced by his writings, and I think that, you know, the letters from prison that were published as letters to Olga was a period in which he read Heidegger, and he read Heidegger very productively. And when I interviewed him in rather difficult times, I was Erica Blair. That was my code name. It's a joke, nobody got it. Eric Blair was Orwell. Havel told me that about one of his earliest childhood memories of walking through green fields with a smokestack, you know, factory in the background, and felt as a young boy that there was something wrong with this. There was something, you know, obnoxious about this. And in those writings, he reflects upon the great dangers of modern technological power. He thought that socialism, Soviet style, was a kind of triumph of that power, that the issue was not capitalism or socialism, but it was the issue of how to restrain and defeat this technological power. And, well, as you know better than I do, Václav Havel came up with principles such as living in the truth, by which he meant that truth has many faces, that there should be a flourishing of plural ways of being in the world, and with strong green sensibilities, I would say. And embedded in those ideas was the very important principle of moc bez mocných, the power of the powerless. And that spirit, that Havelian principle of the power of the powerless, that the most mighty rulers can be defeated by very small-scale acts that reverse the power relations. This is a democratic principle. And I wish we could talk more about him. And finally, I can't read my own notes. How do we think about nature? Well, and human beings, I mean, once again, maybe I'm a traitor to humanity, but it does seem to me that one of the imperatives, and you find it in the flourishing of all of this literature and public discussion about these ecological problems we're witnessing and living through, extreme weather events, COVID-19, etc., is that very dualism between society and nature, between humans and non-human nature, needs to be abandoned. The question then is how to live, how to imagine ourselves in everyday life when we don't live according to that dualism. Well, tonight, I didn't bring you like some Presbyterian minister, you know, the truth. You know the old joke about the Presbyterian minister who preaches in a church in Belfast and says that there could be peace in the Middle East if only Jews and Palestinians accepted the Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, my comments tonight were against that view. I think the flourishing multiplicity of discourses about how to get beyond society and nature are remarkable. They didn't happen before in the history of democracy. They are unique to this generation, and may they long live. I think they provide homes for peoples of different identities and being to live in different ways. If you are Chinese, you can, you know, recall the Liu Ji story of the monkey master, and you live according to that Taoist principle. It's the story of a master who employs monkeys to collect fruits from the forest. and treats them so badly and pays them nothing. And so the monkeys go on strike and they retreat with all of the fruits, and the master is destroyed. I mean, you can, in these times, live according to Taoism. You can try to live according to Donna Haraway's, worlding principle, the principle of care. You can adopt the capabilities approach. You can be a Zadist. You can concentrate on your life on, let's say, global agreements or regional agreements. There are multiple ways in which to do this. And as one sentence, finally, as Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize, reminded us, in this matter of ecology, politics, democracy, the multiplicity of sites of representing nature and trying to deal with the ecological problems, the multiplication of sites is the most effective and efficient policy way of handling what are called wicked problems. Well, or so I think, but I think it's enough. We need some Käse und Wein.
Yes. Two things remain to me. Be invited for Käse and wine downstairs. It was already announced. You made the expectation really big. So be invited downstairs. Second remark, and this is the much more important thing I have to do now. We thank you so much. Thank you a lot, John, for this great talk, for the engaging discussion, and this is your applause.